Member from Vancouver-Fairview.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I rise today to speak to the amendment, in favour of the amendment, and when I rose earlier to speak on the motion to refer, I said it was an honour to speak to this issue because the issue of food security in the agricultural land reserve is so critically important to the future of British Columbians and the future of children, grandchildren, and their children and grandchildren. And so it saddens me that as we discuss in the final stages this very important issue, and this bill that is only so important because of what it proposes to do, to destroy 40 years of protection of British Columbia's agricultural land, 40 years that is the envy of other jurisdictions around Canada and North America, 40 years of preservation that is unparalleled in many parts of the world that wish they had had the foresight that the NDP government of the 1972 to 75 period had. I stand to speak about this important issue with so few people in this House to address this issue, to listen to the debate, to take it seriously, to display for the people in the gallery who have come here today to see democracy in action that anyone actually cares on the government side what is said on the opposition side, any of the evidence that's entered, any of the letters from constituents, any of the studies, any of the history, any of the facts, any of anything that might make a difference to the food security of the people in the gallery, the people 50 years from now, the people 100 years from now. So, Honourable Speaker, I am frustrated today. I am not honoured. I am frustrated. I am disgusted. I am speaking to a motion that says it is not in the best interests of agriculture, food producers, the public, nor those of future generations of British Columbians for the government to change the legislated protection that exists over land and the agricultural land reserve without first determining the possible impacts of those changes to agriculture in our province. Without first, Honourable Speaker, doing the studies, reviewing the studies, commissioning the studies, asking for the studies that would say what the future looks like, not what today looks like, not what the past looks like, but what the future may look like in this era of climate change, in this era of drought down south, in this era of droughts in the southern hemisphere where people are starving, they're fleeing their homes in droves, and they're looking for places that they will be able to move to have some security in their lives, and that security, Honourable Speaker, includes food. But, Honourable Speaker, this bill has been brought forward simply because a couple of members on the opposite side who now unfortunately hold influential positions in cabinet were frustrated because the Agricultural Land Commission didn't move quite quickly enough for them to consider exclusions that in all likelihood were ill-advised in the first place, because the Agricultural Land Commission in fact has approved removals of land that was not suitable for agriculture and perhaps was suitable for other uses. But it seems, Honourable Speaker, that in the exchange of emails that was exposed in the Globe and Mail just the other day, for some members, the Independent Agricultural Land Commission was too much to stomach because they don't believe in independent tribunals that look out for the interests of British Columbians. They believe they were elected and everyone else should jump when they snap their fingers or whistle. Honourable Speaker, that's not a service to young people. It's not a service to British Columbians. And 100 years from now, when people are trying to figure out how to feed themselves in an era made worse because of so many other decisions that we are making, not just in British Columbia, but in Canada and in other jurisdictions, to fail to address the issues of climate change today when we have a chance. 100 years from now, people will wonder what we in this chamber in 2014 were thinking of, Honourable Speaker. They will wonder, Honourable Speaker, how we managed to so cloud our brains as they look back over the record. Perhaps, Honourable Speaker, they will pick up Hansard. And they will listen and pay attention to, as so many members of this House are failing to do, as so many members opposite are failing to do. They will read the letters from all of our constituents. They will read the opinions of scientists. They will read the opinions of experts in agriculture. They will read the opinions of people involved in agriculture, whether they are farmers, whether they are fruit growers, whether they are people who raise cattle, and wonder, Honourable Speaker, why the government was so convinced that there was an urgency to change the entire structure that has served British Columbia for 40 years. Why, Honourable Speaker, it was so important to do that today, in this session of the legislature, rather than take the 2 or 3 months even between now and the fall sitting to consult, to hear properly, to hold public hearings, to let experts come forward, to let the true wishes of people involved in the agricultural industry and the rest of the people of the province of British Columbia and Canada who rely every day on the right to have clean water and good food to sustain them and their families. Honourable Speaker, they will wonder, and they will be right, what was the rush? What was the rush, Honourable Speaker? Why was it so important to engage in changing a structure that has served British Columbia so well for 40 years, instead of look at what problems this legislation is supposed to solve? Because, Honourable Speaker, no one on the government side of the House has made any convincing argument that there is actually a problem that needs solving that this legislation addresses. No one has convinced me, no one has convinced my constituents, no one has convinced the majority, the vast majority of people in the agriculture industry. They certainly haven't convinced the independent chair of the Agricultural Land Commission, who earned the enmity of members opposite, because apparently, instead of preserving and acting to preserve agricultural land in the best interests of British Columbians, he wasn't jumping fast enough to ensure they got the votes needed for re-election. Honourable Speaker, I paraphrase their words, but not by very much at all. Honourable Speaker, today is a sad day in this legislature because this legislation is essentially being rammed down the throats of British Columbians. It's being rammed down the throats against their wishes. It's being rammed down the throats of the agriculture industry. It's being brought forward in contempt of the considered opinion of scientific studies commissioned by the government's own ministers, whether it's in the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of the Environment. Honourable Speaker, I ask again, what's the rush? A responsible government makes sound decisions based on science. The rhetoric we've heard from the side opposite simply says, we have the majority, we're going to do this, don't worry, nothing will change. We want to preserve agricultural land. Nothing's changing about the values we're bringing to bear on decision-making about agricultural land. Honourable Speaker, if that is the case, why is the change being brought forward? If that is the case, why are so many people in the agricultural industry worried about the future, worried about what it means for farming in the future, concerned that the things that would really help them and really help their children and really help young people who want a future as farmers in British Columbia to actually engage and make a living in the agricultural industry. None of those supports are being offered. None of those were brought forward in this bill. In fact, there was no bill to do that at all. There was simply a bill to deconstruct agricultural land in this province based on regional pressure groups for a short-sighted development proposal that may make some financial sense for a handful of people for a few minutes, for a short period of time, but does not make long-term sense for the food security that we so desperately need now, today in British Columbia, because we have droughts in California, now today, tomorrow, next year, the decade after that, and decades after that. Honourable Speaker, my colleague from Coquitlam-Millardville referred to an old acquaintance of mine, a person I once interviewed shortly after he was a member of the government that brought in the Agricultural Land Reserve, Harold Steeves. Harold Steeves has had a long and distinguished life of public service in British Columbia, not just in this House, but as a councillor in Richmond, as somebody who fought to establish the land preserve, as somebody who fought to ensure that the land preserve was respected, as somebody who fought to preserve the integrity of agriculture and food security in this province, as well as somebody who is acutely tuned to the history of his region, whether it was the farming history of that area or the fishery in that area. Harold Steeves has done and contributed great service to British Columbia, and I want to join my colleague in wishing him a happy birthday and putting on the record in this House what a truly great British Columbian he has been. Because by paying respect to truly great British Columbians, it gives us something to measure not just our actions against, but the quality of our deliberations. Honourable Speaker, I say again, and I'm sure Harold Steeves would agree with me, the quality of deliberation can be judged in large part by how much listening goes on, how much attention is paid to diversity of opinion, how much willingness there is, Honourable Speaker, to change direction, to modify direction, to understand that no matter how much we may think that we have the best idea and that we're acting in the best interests, we just might be wrong. And even if we're right and we've failed to convince our fellow citizens, we failed to convince people who work in a particular industry, people who are responsible for feeding not just the people in British Columbia, but other people who rely on us as a food-growing area, that if we failed to convince them, even by that measure, we have more work to do. Even by that measure, more dialogue, more consultation is required. That's why the amendment or the referral motion to committee that was proposed by our caucus was so important. Unfortunately, it failed. It failed even though there's no rush. It failed even though it met the demands of many British Columbians. It failed to the shame of this government, Honourable Speaker. It failed, and by so failing, it demonstrated that the government had no intention of listening to British Columbians. In fact, many members of the caucus opposite had no intention of doing anything other than bending to the will of the former Agriculture Minister and the current Minister responsible for the core review, both of whom have clearly been on record for many years as opposed not just to the work of the Agricultural Land Commission, but the principles of the Agricultural Land Reserve if it ran counter to the interests of anyone in their area who had a short-term development proposal that they thought would do a better job. So, Honourable Speaker, the Minister responsible for the core review, who is not in this legislature today.
Minister, the minister's presence or is not.
I apologize. I apologize, Honourable Speaker, but the Minister responsible for the core. The minister responsible for the core review admitted in this House that he failed to consult, that consultation was important, and he thought that simply saying he would take it upon himself that it was an oversight was adequate, but that actually instituting consultation was not something for which he was responsible, not something that he intended to do, not something that he thought was necessary, and he continued to say in this House, both in speeches and answers to questions, and very often, Honourable Speaker, in remarks that undoubtedly were unrecorded in Hansard and are commonly referred to as heckling, that everything that was in the Act was in the best interests of the best use of agricultural land, and he, like all of us, wanted to preserve agricultural land. Honourable Speaker, his own words in emails do not demonstrate that. His own words in emails, in fact, demonstrate the opposite. His own words on many occasions demonstrate that his regard for the Agricultural Land Reserve and the Commission, whose duty it is to preserve agricultural land in British Columbia, his attitude is that these are institutions and acts that should bend to the will of the government of the day. Honourable Speaker, when we're talking about protecting the agricultural capacity of British Columbia and a heritage that was left to us, and that it's our responsibility to protect and leave to others, when we're talking about that, no one, no institution, no independent tribunal should bend to the will of individual members of the legislature, individual ministers. What needs to be protected is the best interests of British Columbians and the best interests of future generations. Honourable Speaker, let me refer now to some useful information that was provided to all of us by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions in a document entitled Strengthening BC's Agricultural Sector in the Face of Climate Change. This, Honourable Speaker, and I'm pleased to see the Minister of the Environment, this was research that was funded by the Ministry of the Environment and released in May 2013. It starts by saying the science to date is unequivocal. The climate is changing and getting warmer. And it is occurring faster than most climate models and projections have indicated. Recent extreme weather events, such as the 2012 to 2013 record high temperatures and drought in the United States and Australia, Russia's heat wave, and flooding in Pakistan in 2010, have demonstrated the vulnerability of agricultural production and food prices to these events that are projected to increase, Honourable Speaker, in frequency and severity as the climate changes. Honourable Speaker, the report goes on to say that BC is not exempt. Its agricultural sector is also vulnerable to the direct impacts of climate change, as well as the resulting shifts in global economic conditions. As I mentioned, Honourable Speaker, we are seeing that today in unprecedented droughts in California, where virtually the entire state is now subject to drought conditions. The state has cut off the water supply to many agricultural producers. This means that some crops will simply not be grown. Others will be grown and not available for export. And, Honourable Speaker, those that are exported, assuming that's anything at all, will be at record high prices. Honourable Speaker, that is all the more reason for us to take the time in this province to not put in place hastily a structure that will allow agricultural land decision-making to be conducted in a way that experts have said lends itself to local pressures, lends itself to bad decision-making, and lends itself to a lack of an integrated overall provincial agricultural plan. Honourable Speaker, I might concede that it is possible, theoretically of course, possible that the government has a good idea. But if it does, that good idea will be good a few months from now, and it will be tested and should be tested by science, by the opinion of British Columbians, and by agricultural food producers. And by ramming this bill through today, by refusing to refer it to committee, by refusing to consider an amendment that simply says we should use science to look at the possible impacts of those changes to agriculture in our province before we allow them to be made. By refusing to do that, Honourable Speaker, the government is effectively playing a dangerous game of chance with our food security future. Honourable Speaker, let me also quote briefly from an article that refers to Dr. Lenore Newman, who is the Canada Research Chair in Food Security at the University of the Fraser Valley. She talks about us being at peak farm. And what she means by that is that we're limited in the land that can be available for production, and that land, in fact, is now getting less protection. She says, with respect to the changes being proposed, I think what we're going to see happen is loss of land for urban development, especially around Kamloops, which, Honourable Speaker, I would note has been put into Zone 2, proposed for lesser protection, even though its quality would have you think that it should belong in Zone 1. She says, I can't understand why that's being put in Zone 2. It's excellent land, very valuable as farmland, and it's going to be turned into urban development because there's incredible pressure all across the region. There's so much pressure on the land reserve right now. The one amendment I'm most worried about is the change to take it back to regional boards of control. It's hard to say no at the local level. You are under a lot of pressure from people you probably know who want the land out. Now, Honourable Speaker, I'm sure members opposite would say, shouldn't local communities control decision-making about things that impact them? And on many things, that would be the correct statement. But when we're talking about the need to have an integrated web of agricultural land that can sustain all British Columbians, and that is our responsibility in this provincial legislature. When we're talking about that, Honourable Speaker, maintaining an integrated system of agricultural land and agricultural land preservation, it is the wrong approach because, Honourable Speaker, those decisions being made purely on the regional level will not have the provincial view. And along those lines, Honourable Speaker, the current chair of the Agricultural Land Commission, Richard Bullock, has in fact said that, and he said that in a December 23rd letter that he addressed with respect to consideration of changes to the Agricultural Land Commission. He addressed it to the Deputy Minister of Agriculture, Derek Sturcove, and he says, I won't read the whole letter, obviously it's many pages and it was very thoughtful and very well reasoned. But he says, by way of introduction, I referred to the findings set out in my November 2010 Chair's review. And he said, in that review, I suggest consideration be given to a governance model that establishes a single decision-making body, 7 members, while retaining regional representation from each of the Agricultural Land Commission's 6 administrative regions. A smaller structure will facilitate more in-depth dialogue amongst commissioners regarding planning, ALR boundary reviews, and policy matters, while at the same time building a cohesive team with staff. He goes on to say that in this letter he proposes a slightly different and expanded board, but along the same principles of regional representation, but with a central cohesive structure so the overall provincial interest in preserving agricultural land could be maintained. So he says that it will allow for meaningful regional panel decision-making, be more manageable from a financial perspective, and ensure that all decisions comply with the requirements of the law, procedural fairness, and the exercise of discretion, even while taking regional considerations into account. Honourable Speaker, that's the key, I believe, taking regional considerations into account without allowing regional pressures to lead to bad decision-making in the worst interests of the people of the province overall. Honourable Speaker, I could go on for a long time, notwithstanding the half-hour limit, but unfortunately the time allocation motion means that others of my colleagues also wish to speak. But I'm going to use the minute or two remaining to me to simply say that, as my colleague, the member from Vancouver Point Grey, pointed out, I too have received an incredible amount of communication on this issue. Just since last Saturday, I have received 129 emails in my office on this issue. And let me read you a very short excerpt. It was copied to me. It's from one of my constituents and was sent to the Premier. And it says, "Dear name, I am very concerned about this province's future. I am a mother, and I speak as a concerned mother and voter. The Agricultural Land Reserve needs protection, and please halt your changes and honor an important independent governing body. Your actions, no matter how your government spins it, taken in context, look like you were trying to make protected BC lands belonging to the collective whole open for resource development. Excruciatingly and dangerously short-sighted. Sincerely, Hilary Strang." Now, Honourable Speaker, a brief excerpt from yet another letter on behalf of the Creston Valley Agricultural Society. It was to the Minister. "We held another public meeting last night, and it was well attended by a wide cross-section of farmers from our diverse agriculture valley, from beef, dairy, and field crop growers to smaller lot fruit, vegetable, and market gardeners. Absolutely no one voiced any support for this divisive bill. We are encouraged by your apparent desire to hear from farmers from around this province, and at the same time disgusted by," and here the name of the Minister for the Core Review is inserted, "closed-mind attitude on this very important matter. The wording in the bill is far too vague and open to different interpretations, and thus abuse by persons with intentions other than preserving our limited farmable land." Well, Honourable Speaker, that's the view. That summarizes the view of many British Columbians. Unfortunately, they took heart in the Agriculture Minister's claim that he was willing to consult a bit too early. It appears now that for the Agriculture Minister, consultation means either reading emails or passing a bill, ramming it through, using time allocation, and then pretending to listen to the concerns of British Columbians when it's in fact too late legislatively to address it. Honourable Speaker, let me close by saying today is a sad day. It's a sad day for food security. It's a sad day for British Columbians' future. It's a sad day for democracy. And it's a sad day for the young people who are in the gallery looking at how this government and this government's approach to legislation about such a critical issue is so stone deaf to the concerns of British Columbians and people in the industry. Thank you very much.